Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I think we're trying to make a definite shift here from the voice side to data. That was a pretty good video that's been released in the UK, and I'm sure there's other examples from the other countries here today. Before I introduce our high-caliber panel, can I say two things? First of all, we will finish by 12:30, so lunch will be there. And secondly, thank you very much for attending the final session on the final day. Resilience is well appreciated from you. We're going to look at how we could advance industry's collaboration to secure the global network infrastructure. And I think on every session we've had this week, there's been a mention of security as we've gone through things. And we've talked about blockchain, we've talked about bots, we've talked about IoT. So hopefully the panel today can start to flesh that out and give you some ideas before you go on your planes and trains later on. I think the first challenge is really how we perceive that global infrastructure. Is it a neutral environment, or have we got it split into regional blocks, which reflect our trading and our military alliances? In other words, are we looking at Europe, are we looking at US, China and Russia as different domains within that feature? The second question is, do we look just within national borders for the carriers, or are we looking at wholesale operators and carriers having a more global responsibility? We will be looking at cybersecurity mainly, but we shouldn't forget both the physical and the personnel security to ensure that ourselves and our customers are fully protected. I think there's a good example this morning. There's been a finding about Facebook and how much they're going to have to pay. Not a huge amount for them, I should imagine, but that's what happens when data starts going missing. On the physical side, we've got to look at the safeguarding of things like the cable landing stations and the cables themselves in the submarine environment, and make sure those sites and the internet exchanges and the points of presence are secure, physically secure from access from people gaining entry into there. And also looking at the personnel security as well, making sure we vet staff before they join, and when they leave a company, making sure that they've got their privileged user accesses removed, and also that we change the passwords of systems they're on, so they can't get access once they've left a company. And I'm sure most of you have been in situations where that has happened. For those companies operating in the European Union, we'd like to hear a little bit more, not only from the speakers, but also from yourselves about the new EU Network Information Security Directive, and whether it should be more than just a directive and cover more areas and have a bit more meat behind it. In America last week, for example, the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC, said that companies who don't stop hacks could be breaching the law. Now, that could well stretch beyond the company concerned to their network or service provider if they were proved culpable, and they could then be fined going through that. So we are seeing the regulatory groups actually taking far more interest in what's going through. But enough from me. Could I introduce the panel for today's discussion? Could I introduce Lior, who's Head of Carrier Relations at RAKUTEN Fiber?
Hi everyone, my name is Lior. I'm heading the Carrier Relations team in Viber, RAKUTEN Viber actually now. I am dealing mostly with voice and SMS, and let's say for this panel, I will bring our insights from fraud attacks that we see on our retail services. We also see it on the wholesale side, but I think that the retail side would be the one that is more interesting. And I believe that unlike other retailers, since Viber is a global app and we're really looking at all of the destinations, for us it's an even bigger challenge to confront these fraud attacks and how we handle them and how we learn from them every day.
Thanks, Dave. Can I introduce Jonathan, who's the Chief Executive Officer at C2 Cyber?
Hi everyone. I started professional life in uniform, moved into BT, one of our host sponsors up there, and then left large corporate to start something that helps smaller organisations achieve the same level of protection as the larger ones. Actually, I think we're doing rather well with the smaller ones relative to the larger ones in some cases. We look at human cybersecurity, so rather than just the boxes and the software and all of the buzzwords of blockchain and ML, we look at the people and the basics and trying to get the arguably simpler bits but high volume bits when you have employees sorted out. So yeah, we're having a busy time at the moment.
Okay, and Max from Deutsche Telekom, who heads up their IP and peering side, looking particularly at sort of the DDoS area. And Max has spoken at the conference before, and I'm sure he's got a new insight for this year as well.
Yeah,
Max.
thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Max. I'm working for Deutsche Telekom Global Carrier, and I'm responsible for IP transit interconnectivity and DDoS defense mainly. I'm with that organization for more than 10 years now, and I'm with DT for more than almost 20 years. And I've worked in various positions there, and also including a lot of net neutrality topics and the interconnection part and cybersecurity, especially DDoS defense, which enabling basically the networks to be run a lot of services that we all use every day for our end customers and our business customers.
Thanks, Dr. Max. I see we've got first question. I'd also remind you that if you'd like to get questions, put them on Slido and we'll go through them as we go through the presentation. What I'd like to do first of all, we saw a little bit of a flavour for it on the video. I'd like to look at a sort of analysis of what happened in 2018, and maybe if we can get a crystal ball, start looking at what the future trends could be in 2019. And I appreciate, we've got quite a spread within the panel. Some of those areas will be interesting with it. Other things which we then could pick up on and take as the theme going forward. So I'm going to hand over to our expert who's actually advises people on this sort of issue all the time as his company role. So Jonathan, could you just take us through what you see as the trend?
Sure. So I'm not going to make any predictions for 2019. So we see that a lot, and I don't think that's sensible. But I think it's fairly safe to say that we're going to continue to be busy in cybersecurity and trying to protect against attacks in 2019. Now, I divide this up for the purposes of the audience between attacks, where someone is coming for you, and breaches, which is where you have been deficient in your own security or you've done something wrong, you've improperly configured something. So breaches, arguably something you could address more simply than someone attacking your company. Notables in 2018, do people remember FedEx, which was a number of millions of records of customer data, all of their data, in a AWS bucket. So they simply didn't put the security on it, and it was accessible to everybody in AWS. One of our sponsors up there, and I won't name them, but they had an API where you could put their mobile number of a consumer into a portal, and which someone thoughtfully built around the API, and with no checks or authentication, it would return their entire customer record, including billing, home address, the whole lot. That was up for 3 months after the company had been told it was there. So after they'd been notified, it took them 90 days to secure it. They're a global carrier. That is not great. Let's gloss over Facebooks and MyHeritages and things, because that's all on Sky News. I've noticed, though, that over here in Europe, we don't see much about places like the Indian subcontinent, where all of their biometric data was released, 1.1 billion records, which included your address, your photo, your blood group, the whole lot. And somebody, again, thoughtfully produced a website where you could type in a random string of digits that was the right length for their social security number, the Aadhaar number, and it would return all of those details, including their photo. So you could either go one way, or you could go in reverse and see if a number had a person attached to the back of it. Fascinating stuff. And that's irretrievable now. So that's 1.1 billion people who went in, got their ID card, did their biometrics, and somebody leaked the whole lot to the internet. That's remiss. So there's a breach. Attacks, the US universities back in early 2018, was that March this year? VPN filter, anyone in here heard of that? I'll take hands, I can see the audience. Any VPN filter? No? So that's a firmware attack on the routing hardware that you guys all use and your customers' endpoint stuff. Very bad news. And then obviously, I will say Supermicro, the servers that have been compromised with new shiny Ethernet ports functioning as a computer in a computer, really. So that's supply chain stuff. And if you get a compromised supply chain down to the hardware level, you're going to need your host nation state support to fix that, I would venture. But there are things you can do with your supply chain, particularly the people as well. So we've got one question about people so far. And one of the things I wanted to raise on that was the insistence of people in our industry on things like LinkedIn of advertising their skill set. If they've got a highly classified area of expertise, please don't put it down as a certification because people just search for it. And then you've got their photo and you go into Facebook, and from a social engineering perspective, you can find these people very easily. I probably shouldn't start on that, so that's trends. So I've got breaches and attacks. I think they are different, but breaches are the one where everybody, there's been something gone wrong inside your organization if you get one of those. That was remiss. An attack, someone's coming for you anyway. And if we can divide those two up, we can have a more sensible conversation.
Max, can we have a sort of input from your side, because you're there defending your customers and you've got tools to do that. What are you seeing?
There are different kinds of attacks, so not just DDoS attacks, also coming from vulnerabilities, so they are increasing every time. But I see also, to phrase it in a positive way, I see customers and carriers are more prepared to fight against those attacks. So taking the example of DDoS again, it's been not even half a year ago then we peaked, or the largest DDoS attacks, which was 1.4 tera, and there was short afterwards there was a 1.7 tera attack. To give you a rough example, nobody in the enterprise world and also in the smaller carrier world can defend themselves without having an external help against those kind of attacks. There's no way, because you can't handle that amount of traffic by your own. You need help from an external partner or your peers. So that's bringing to the collaboration part. And then there are smaller attacks that don't come to that public knowledge, but they are there every day. Yeah? So a carrier who hasn't seen, or a customer who hasn't seen a DDoS attack, or similar layer 7 DDoS attacks, that doesn't exist. Or they're lying.
Or they don't know.
Oh, they don't know. Well, spotting a DDoS attack is kind of easy. Yeah? It's like an outage of power on your router. That's the easiest thing if you explain back home the effect on a DDoS attack.
Thanks for that. Lior, have you got anything to add to those comments?
Sure. I mean, we can definitely, I can definitely give my input on how we see the fraud attacks on 2018. Since our retail service is mainly credit card based, we see a lot of purchases that are made with stolen credit cards and many hacks, and making more and more calls, and it's getting harder and harder to catch them. The interesting thing to see is the summer vacation, where we actually saw a very big peak. And going back to our engineers, they're just saying it's a lot of youth that are actually using the summer activity to hack and make these things happen. And we actually saw the decrease September 1st in the hacks, because people get back to their studying. So that's a very interesting thing that we saw. But overall, 2018, besides the normal high-cost destinations that we saw a lot of fraud on voice, the new trend was getting into the low cost with massive attempts. So we saw destinations like Poland and the UK, where we saw massive attacks on our services, and it's getting just more and more difficult, but we're getting smarter and smarter as well, so it's a cat and mouse kind of thing.
Okay, no, thanks for that. I mean, it's interesting that on the black side, they're training the youth up the same as on the white side. You've got people like GCHQ running crypto schools during the summer holidays.
Yeah.
So I hadn't really realised that. I think the other thing that's been mentioned quite a bit over the last few days is looking really at IoT devices. So I'd be interested in the panel's view on with the number of IoT devices being rolled out, and particularly as they're cheap as chips, and there's no security or very little security on them, what do they think is going to happen with that, where we are starting to see bot attacks coming through? Max, probably for you on that.
Yeah, well, there is a very simple answer. The more devices on the internet and the better they are connected to the internet, the easier it is to find them and the larger future attacks will be. Yeah, so imagine in the past you had a computer at home that was, if it was your private computer, that was maybe online for a few hours in the evening. And now we have a router which is online 24/7. And behind that router, there is a fridge, there is a webcam, there is anything you can imagine these days which is online 24/7. And whenever you can get credentials in that and hijack that device, it can send either traffic to somebody else in terms of, well, that they switch on your surveillance cam and put your private living room and onto the internet. That's one thing. But also it could be misused as a bot for DDoSing somebody else.
Okay, and from your side as well, you're briefing obviously where you go around to these companies and to government. So are you seeing what they're putting in place to look at bot attacks?
Is that me?
To you.
Yeah, it is an interesting field. We've seen the attack, the Myra attack, the botnet thing, with lots of IP CCTV cameras that are just directly connected if you've got lots of outstations. So we're working with a CNI organisation, a couple of thousand off-site places. So they might have broadband sending back things like CCTV from the door or the gate of the facility concerned. There isn't any security. They've not deployed firewalls to all these sites particularly, and so that stuff gets used. I think the trend that we see both between what I hear from the public sector and in the private sector is that default passwords are half the problem. So if it takes you 2 minutes to set your new IP camera up watching your baby, then please change the password. But if the password is admin or 4 zeros or similar, then the manufacturers have a part to play. Z-Wave, the first generation, has been cracked, but the second generation is much more secure. If people roll out a couple of hundred of those into their shiny new house, we need to make sure they don't come with the password admin, please, because that's just too easy. It should be take 2 minutes longer to set up and not have a default password. There are some really simple things. We gloss over all that stuff. We don't necessarily need military-grade encryption in everyone's house, but let's not have the password admin.
So I think what you're saying is it's really a case of following the rules. So actually putting some basic security measures in place. And there's enough crypto agencies which are putting that advice out to people. And there's companies like yourself who are selling your services once people have been hacked.
But we work with private sector enterprises and SMEs where they're actually interested in doing that, and they'll spend 5 minutes doing it. If you're rolling out a baby cam, you don't want to do that in your house. So I think we've got to take that to the manufacturing layer of who is designing it, the product designers, and how it's accessible, and make it secure by design. Apologies for using the slogan of the month, but if we can do privacy by design, so anyone that's not heard of GDPR, please see me afterwards, and then privacy by design for the design of these things to make them safe. If we're not doing those two things, we're letting down the consumers at the far end of this carrier chain and the people in the middle with their open APIs.
So I think, what we're seeing from this threat analysis of what's there is, yes, there's a lot more attacks going through, but there's basic things that we can do to defend ourselves against those. And we don't put those in place, whether it's down at the simple level of changing passwords or even looking at web servers. So
sorry, Tim, sorry to interrupt, but that's also for new carriers, right? So there are default passwords on all the Cisco boxes that leave the factory. They don't come with a new password, they're all default.
Yeah.
So I'm not just talking about baby cams, I'm talking about racked and stacked stuff over the road. We need to get away from that.
And I mean, from my example, one of the companies I work for, when you looked at all the Cisco routers on there, they had football teams on there, because that's the preference of the guy who was the IP engineer at the time. I think the other thing I wanted to pull out from that was we are complacent as an industry. There are things we can do. It's not just the security team's role, it's the IT team's role to do. One of the facts I pulled out was there's 80% of the web servers are vulnerable, and that percentage has not improved over time. So we've not got the root issues sorted out and actually taken those through. Just putting a crystal ball up, not my predictions, but ones that I've sort of gathered. Crypto-related crime will exceed all other crypto attacks, cyber attacks in 2018. 67% of global organizations have been breached, with 36% in the last year. And if you speak to Jonathan, he actually thinks it's 100 have been breached. It's just that 33% haven't found out they've been breached yet. And then you start looking at it. Ransomware is down, crypto mining is up, criminals are now following the money. We've got, we talk about as a service being deployed for
They've got some good summer schools as well, actually.
Yeah.
So, organised crime are running crypto summer schools, but the interface for some of those is a lot slicker than the public sector ones. So.
And that was one of the things that, again, I sort of was discovering that ransomware as a service is actually out there. You can go and find a developer and come up with a percentage share with him on what he sort of writes, and he will write you bespoke software to go and put that ransomware in place. So we're up against a very sophisticated enemy, target, whatever you want to call it. And I think in the earlier presentation, but one, somebody mentioned an arms race on both sides. And that's very true. Every time we put a defense in, there's an attack against that defense as we go through with it. So we've painted a fairly dismal picture. There is some light at the end of the tunnel. What we want to do is now look at, you know, what can we as an industry start putting in place to actually put that there. The next question is really, are we too closed off within the industry talking about network security? Is it something we keep to ourselves, or is it something we should be sharing more as a community and actually taking it through? And are we actually causing problems for ourselves within the telco industry because it's not something we address? Max, is that something that resonates with Deutsche Telekom, or is it something that you share with both other partners and customers?
Yeah, well, we share, so among the industry with customers and partners, we share threat intelligence. And we share them very openly. So whenever you, for example, there's a website of Deutsche Telekom where you can, that can you publicly access, and you see of our honeypots what kind of attacks are currently happening, what you see on a day-to-day basis, and you see it live. Yeah, but this is just a small part of the entire traffic and the entire attacks, but just to make people aware that what is happening there. And obviously, when there are larger attacks, you need to collaborate somehow. Luckily, there has not been that large attacks that we need to collaborate, but you never know what the future brings. And we also have services for our customers to share that as well. But also for private households, for example, if you or your private equipment, let's say, became part of a botnet and is constantly sending traffic, we notify you on the first side via email, but also we notify our customers by sending them a classical letter in paper and let them know you should go to that website, follow some basic instruction as changing your password or something in order to not be a bot anymore. So it's taking that problem as close to its origin as possible.
Okay. And from your side, Jonathan, you're advising again going in. Do you see a reticence from the telcos and the network operators?
Reticence from what?
About security.
No, but we were talking earlier about one of the majors appointing their first CISO. That shouldn't be news. So if you guys are moving that volume of data around, having an information security officer, whether it's for your own stuff and consumer records, or the data that you're moving from point A to point B, that's basics. So often there is an information security function, but who does it report into? Are you marking your own homework if they report to the CIO, for example? Should they report to the CIO or someone else on the board? These are all things that we've seen out in the wild. I think NIST-D coming along will help. So the Network Information Security Directive should it ever clear Europe, and should we have to obey it in the UK? It's all timing. But I think we should. We're looking at this with primary and secondary care in the NHS at the moment. So where organisations approach us and they have lots of patient records. They can be on paper, but they are moving to electronic patient management systems. How do they do that in a safe way? So that's actually quite hard. They then have a massive bonfire to get rid of the paper records. They're taking it quite seriously. When they phone their supplier of telephone services or their data backhaul, so MRI scanners produce a lot of data. So they have fairly robust relationships with their carriers and their telcos. If they phone up and they can't get through to an information security team, they get frustrated. They've got one. Why isn't the telco? So who do they talk to when they want to talk about the other end of that link? So that's been really interesting.
And you're seeing the same on your side of the wholesale business there?
Yeah, I mean, in telcos, let's say, if we look at it generally, then I think in the past 10 years, carriers mostly started to abandon the whole TDM physical interconnection. We saw many more IP interconnections that are much cheaper and easier to handle, but with that, there are much more security hazards. So now we see another shift of carriers doing more and more secured interconnections, more and more secured IPs. It costs more money. It's a little bit harder to do, but we see it happening more and more, and I think this is the trend that will continue with the biggest tier ones. Even the old-fashioned ones, they have to abandon the TDM, moving on to the secured IPs, and only that way they can actually secure that there are no breaches and work more and more on the secured voice part. Because eventually, you know, if we look at it on a wholesale point of view, and the last session actually touched it a lot, is that, you know, the money is with the retailers, and you know, Viber has a very big retail platform, and we see and we suffer from it a lot. And the wholesalers within themselves are making all of the money because, you know, we eventually get the stolen credit cards and we're eventually not being paid. And I think that gradually the big tier one will start working only within each other, working only on secured IPs, going directly to the networks, and we'll see more and more wholesale carriers eventually abandoned because of the fight against fraudulent activities.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, we heard yesterday that Verizon are going to be putting in place a chief information security officer because they're taking security far more seriously. When I started looking at this, one of the questions we were asked to look at was an update on the carrier initiatives and the working groups that are out there actually looking at what they do in security. And although there's lots of crypto working groups and crypto teams in each of the countries and in the regions, the EU, for example, and also from the manufacturers and vendors, there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort of that going forward. I couldn't really find anything there. I mean, I was looking for something a bit like the BA's One World or the Star Alliance. I was expecting to find that the telcos where they partnered maybe in voice or data, those partnerships were reflected where they were working on security. And I've not been able to find that anywhere. And, you know, I'm interested to find out from guys who worked at Deutsche and at BT if they're actually involved in any discussions with other carriers on security and how they can actually tackle it. I think, Max, you mentioned the fact you share this information, but is there a more formal arrangement of looking at a little bit like the Leadership Forum, which we've heard about for blockchain and for fraud? You know, has anyone thought of setting one of those up yet to look at security and what the ramifications are going to be going forward? So, Max, is there something out there I've missed?
Yes. Well, the Leadership Forum is partly one of that. I will come to that in a second. Well, there are a lot of conferences, starting with Global Peering Forum, IETF, RIDE meetings, NANOC, all those things. They have dedicated work streams on security. And often driven by manufacturers of equipment who have a certain expertise in a specific field, but the importance is raised there. So everybody these days knows that we are living in a connected world, and without that connectivity of the internet, we won't be where we are today. There is a manufacturer that has in a statement that they claim to be the guardian of the connected world, and they collaborate very often with the carriers. As the the Deutsche Telekom slogan is "Life is for sharing," of course we share our knowledge. And for example, we just had yesterday a meeting in a security summit of the GLF workstream where around 30 carriers participated in looking into certain topics. DDoS is one of the major topics where this really makes sense to collaborate because you can help out each other on attacks. And we've started with very interesting ideas on how to fight against those attacks. So a typical example is on DDoS, the best practice is to detect it as close as possible to the victim, but to defend it as close as possible to its origin source. So literally, if there are 2 transit networks involved to go to or 3 to go to the victim, so there's the one where the attack starts, there's a transit carrier in the middle, and then there is the autonomous system, the network, where the victim sits. So why should we all transport the way all along the internet? Yeah? In just stopping it where it starts. There are technical ways, even today. You can do more advanced there, but just stopping it there where it starts has ever been an emergency procedure for the really, really, really large attacks among carriers, but this is a real forward that I'm looking for in much, much closer collaboration with other carriers.
And we heard earlier on the fraud session that they were looking at people within there. I mean, we've got question 1, I know, which we've had a little bit of a discussion on, but how can the carriers working together to look at security with their staff in screening and making sure they've got the right people, and if they've got the wrong person, he doesn't go and join another company and wreak havoc there as well?
Oh.
He or she, I should say.
Well, I don't want to go into an HR discussion on how to security check people, let's say, but well, you should create, and this is also a big initiative we do, create awareness among your employees whenever you're contacted by somebody else that might not be the one who are supposed to do. And you can imagine that our network operations center gets calls each and every day and they pretend to be a certain carrier and want to set up a port or shut down a port or something like that. And we always have security measurements with our customers to verify it. Yeah? So all of our customers know that sometimes a bit painful, yeah, if you forget the instructions, let's say, but if you call our network operations center, we have to prove that you're the one you pretend to be. Yeah, that's a very simple thing, but those things has to be done. And yeah, those people are always, or have always been a weak point in the chain, yeah, when it comes to security, definitely.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And your side, Jonathan, is there anything when you were in BT or since which you've seen where you're seeing those carriers working closely together?
No, but I had a few conversations before here, and in BT, absolutely. So there are some working groups and people are coordinating on those at both strategic and the working level. Not all of that comes out of the woodwork. People don't advertise that because that's almost part of the security of how you guys are trying to fix these things. But there is quite a lot to do, and it does come back to the people as well, that this isn't just a technical fix. So there are lots of vendors in the marketplace with things like AI and machine learning, cybersecurity tools. There are indications this morning, yesterday, that one of those has been rolled over and suffered an IT breach. So we get back to the cobbler's son of having issues. We need to make sure that the people we're working with and our vendors are safe, and that they're putting tools in that don't have trapdoors and backdoors and are secure by design. I don't see as much of that. So inside the big carriers, I think there is a conversation that happens, and it's structured, as you say. There are forums and there are work streams. But that's often the big carriers whose names are all behind me. There are thousands of carriers, as per this conference and the Americas version and out in the Far East. So I don't think that we address all points on the network. I was in here watching the thing before about fraud, and the smaller carriers are the place where a lot of that enters the network or leaves it. If you're moving it in the middle because you're one of the big carriers, then you're in transit, but the entry and exit nodes might not be as safe, might not be in the leadership forum because you'd end up with 3,000 delegates. So how do you get that thought leadership to the whole carrier market? I think that's the hard bit.
Okay, so I mean, what I'm really hearing here is there's informal arrangements in place between the carriers, there's passage of information that goes through, but maybe what we should be asking is, you know, we've got a leadership forum that's doing very well with blockchain. Can we get Carl Grevner and can we get Mark Halfinger to do the initiative again, but look at security? We've got 30 companies now looking at blockchain. Some of that is going to be security related at some stage with it. So it is, again, something we as an industry should address and actually take through. I haven't forgotten the referendum. It's one thing I was trying to avoid today, talking about Brexit. But we will cover that later on when we go through. So I think, you know, as a group, we've talked about this beforehand. We certainly think that there's room for an initiative across the industry to look at security in the whole, to look at things that are coming like IoT, to see what the impact is going to be on us as an industry, and what we should be putting in place with the vendors and the other concerned parties and interested parties in how we take that through. So we've dealt with the sort of telco side of it and the carrier market, but how do we deal with the telcos and with the regulatory bodies? I think every country I sort of looked at within Europe, there was a crypto security group at the national level. There's certainly one at the EU. I'm sure they communicate to each other. I know the UK one actually puts out advice to industry and also runs training courses there and puts that video together, which we watched earlier on with what the threats were. But do you think on that side there's a close enough engagement between the telecom industry and the regulatory and government on what they should be doing? And that one, Jonathan, probably, if you could lead.
I'll start. I think in the UK it's very good. So NCSC takes some of its staff, actually, they're on secondment from some of the carriers in the UK.
Is this the top 100, the 100 scheme they talk about?
I don't know. I probably shouldn't talk about it. I'm no longer at BT.
It's on open source, I think.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I know some of my old team are on secondment and working around that stuff. So, and that produces a two-way communications effect, so that's really useful. The CISP, which is you have to be vetted and sponsored by someone in the public sector to join the forum, the cybersecurity portal that NCSE runs. So that's like threat intel and a few other bits and pieces. They push things out and they're discussed by industry experts. That's actually very useful. So it's unstructured, it's more discussion than a feed that you can take, but it is quite useful. And they run a lot of events. So that's more UK only. I think the area that we've seen more collaboration is needed is post-GDPR being implemented, Data Protection Act in the UK, but vice versa other places, is the ICO and NCSE working really closely together on breaches and preventing them. So it's all very well people running around saying it costs you 4% of global revenue if you screw up, but how do we stop them screwing up? And how do we incentivize that? And how do we get them training and all those good things? That's work in progress. There are things going on, but always more to do.
Okay. And Lior, coming to you, because we've got two guys here who've been in sort of the incumbent's position. What about your side? What are you seeing on that?
Well, what we see is that the telco industry is kind of divided because on the one hand, we have, especially the tier ones, the guys behind us, and the big ones that are being affected, that they really want to prevent all of these fraud attacks. They would say, I'm going to connect mostly to the MNO and I will use many test tools and I want to prevent these fraud attacks. But on the other hand, voice market is declining. So everyone is looking for additional revenue streams, and you know, it's the right hand versus the left hand for many carriers. So the one hand, they would say, I'm going to prevent it, but on the other hand, on the wholesale department, yeah, we want to increase revenues, and we actually see, even with the biggest players in the market, that they go along with fraud attacks because they see the revenues come, they're being paid, and they pay themselves, and we see it actually evolving, getting harder and harder, and as I said, you have one department who's dealing with the retail side, and they are fighting the fraud activities a lot. But on the other hand, the wholesale department would just go along because they see the benefits on their side. They have their revenue goals on their side, and it's a cat and mouse, and it's very, very difficult to tackle.
Okay. And your side, Max, you've been involved with drafting part of the framework within the EU on papers. So what are you seeing there between sort of government?
Well, government organizations typically have the issue that they're looking after one country. And the internet is a global thing somehow, yeah? And if you are too narrow with your responsibility, then it becomes an issue. But so there are a lot of initiatives in Germany that they make aware or create awareness from the government side, and also the government itself. They made the department that is responsible for cybersecurity, they increased it a lot, more people, more resources financially. So that's very important. For example, there's a law on critical infrastructure that every critical infrastructure should be prepared against certain cyber threats, which is, I really appreciate that initiative. And they also give out from the government side recommendations. For example, an energy company or a critical infrastructure should be protected against DDoS attacks. So they certified vendors and suppliers on the side that are capable of fulfilling the task. And this is, I really appreciate that, because not that we are on the list, well, we are on the list, and it's a bit of marketing for us as well, but it makes people's life easier. Imagine you're working for a small energy supplier, you have so many tons on your desk, and you can just check out the public website from the government, giving you reliable resources on whom to contact. Yeah, that makes your life a lot easier, and they are really aware of the threats that could come, because they faced attacks themselves. Yeah, and this is one thing everyday life when you feel the pain yourself, it's much easier to understand it.
And looking at the question we've got there, number one, looking about the UK referendum, the US election, where potentially that was attacked at some stage. You know, a government's a bigger cyber threat than private companies.
Well, there's...
Or a target. I wasn't sure it was a target or a threat.
Yeah, let's read it as a target. I think governments are... We've known that since 2007, when Estonia has been attacked by somebody on the DDoS side. Yeah? So the cyber war thing is there. And there are governments hacked, there are DDoS attacks on public websites and those kind of things. So they are definitely a target. I would not judge if it's more than a private individual or a certain company, but, well, you can ask yourself, what is more important, if a number of individuals are hacked, or an entire government, or your president? Yeah, so
we're really looking there is that there should be a security level across the whole piece which sorts out all of that,
yeah.
Not just one particular area.
Yeah.
I mean, there is critical national...
Well, politicians sitting in the government, they also want to have that issue with bring your own device. Yeah?
Yeah.
And how you tell a senior minister you have to secure your device. Yeah?
Well, and also people joining the workforce as well. So in my company, you try telling a millennial with no shoes on that they can't bring their own iPhone into the office. It's actually quite hard. They just leave. So that's a challenge.
Okay. So, I mean, the other thing is we've talked about government, we've talked about telecoms, but we're part of a big ecosystem. I mean, there's guys here today from data centers, there's ISPs, some companies have got all functionality inside. But how do we bring those guys on board as well, so you aren't just looking at the carrier market and the wholesale business, and you've got everybody else involved in this end-to-end link? So any ideas on that of how we bring in these other companies who also are in the supply chain? I think it was a question Jonathan and I were talking about earlier, is you've got to start going back to the supply chain as well and see where that leads. BA, I think I got hacked the other week by BA, I was a BA exec member and my account was hacked apparently when I was booking flights, and that was done through one of their supply companies going through, and that's where they got the information from. So how do we address that and look at the whole end-to-end picture? Who wants to pick that one up? I'll throw that one out.
Well, let's start about the connectivity and the availability. Yeah. If you have a data center and you can run a virtual or rent a virtual server, and this was just said by Darren from NTT on the previous panel, you can rent a virtual machine for $10 a month, and you don't know how to run it actually. So maybe it's unsecured tomorrow, yeah, and it can be used for to initiate an attack, yeah. And then it's hard to follow that it comes from a data center supplier, yeah, that it's actually you that is somehow responsible for that attack. So I think the senders of traffic should get a bit more responsibility or create awareness with their customers and their suppliers as well to make aware of that the whole ecosystem is kind of fragile, yeah, with all these issues that are coming.
Anything else to add from the other two?
So we in C2 do a lot of work with big retailers, healthcare providers with 1,000 sites in the UK on supply chain security. And we use international standards, so we are not rebuilding AI systems to fix this stuff. We're using ISO 27001, and that's fairly basic, but they're not doing much of it. So if we can address that, and it's all codified, and we get a version every 3 or 4 years that we can upgrade to, we can go through all of those control measures, and they pop out stronger and safer. At that point, good time to start looking at advanced things and AIs and machine learning. But if you've left the back door open and your data center's propped open with a fire extinguisher, you've got a bigger problem. So, especially if you're swapping data with suppliers. So we saw an example. A company donates charitably and allows its staff to take a salary sacrifice to donate to charity of their choice. They ship the money out in bulk from the employer, and every month HR sent an Excel spreadsheet to the charity payment processor that splits the money up and sends it to the charities. So they emailed the Excel spreadsheet, so there's the first no-no. When we got a copy of the Excel spreadsheet, it had, this was sent to the supplier. They didn't have a breach, but it had a load of hidden rows. The hidden rows were every employee of the organisation, 85,000 of them, who hadn't donated to charity. So they'd just taken the entire payroll, including their home addresses, how much they were paid, what percentage they wanted to donate, so column 1 times by column 2, spat out the number. But there were loads and loads of rows that they weren't donating, from the chairman downwards. So it's sent in the clear, sparking.
Can't be true, huh, isn't it?
And that was 2 months ago. So we need to fix the simple stuff.
I promised everyone we're finished by 12:30. I failed, but I'm going to draw it to a close. Can I just ask our panel just to come up with their final thoughts on what maybe the one lesson you hopefully will take away from today's meeting? Lior.
Well, I think that looking at the telco industry, we have to invest more and more into security. Today, the data centers don't really give that service of security. We see it just supplying the ground for us to work on. And the content service providers, there are and play their role into this, but the collaboration is not that as what we would like to see. And we need to see better results if we all work together and just lifting the security within those data centers.
Jonathan?
Get the basics right, look at things like Cyber Essentials, your national equivalent, ISO 27K, ask your staff to calm down, tell them they're wonderful, but please take their specializations off LinkedIn and so on, makes it harder for me to find them, and get your CFO to pay for it by reducing his risk provision pot. then you get the money to fund this stuff.
From my point of view, it's enabling, it's collaboration, exchange, and sharing. And one very nice thing our CEO said to a larger audience at a conference lately, if it comes to security, don't listen to your financial people, listen to your security staff.
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious we had one question on there about bot attacks. I think the answer is yes, it is going to be harder. We've got to do something about it. But I think maybe if we look at the leadership forum of taking this forward as a security issue for them to address and to get an initiative behind that, that would be great. But certainly for the CEOs and CIOs today who are here, there was some advice that came out quite recently, and it was basically, you know, what as a company would you do if you had a malware attack, and how confident are you that your IT department put in place the latest patches, the software updates, and also how many shadow IT resources are you using? How many cloud-based services which your staff think are useful are they using on the company network, but actually your IT department aren't aware of and haven't paid for? And that's where the point that I think Jonathan raised is very pertinent, is if we did the basics properly, our life would be a lot easier going forward. A couple of questions I'd like you to go back and ask is, how do you defend your organization against phishing attacks? How do you control the use of privileged IT accounts? How do you ensure that your software and devices are up to date? And how do you ensure that your partners and suppliers protect the information that you share with them? And you've heard some instances here today of that. And I think if we did those basics, I think it would be a lot better for us going forward in what we do. I'd like you to thank the panel, please, on a very good discussion. It was fairly wide-ranging, and we've managed to complete it in a bit less time than we originally said. Okay? Thanks very much, guys.